They said it was tragic. They said it was accidental. They said there was nothing more to investigate. A teenage girl vanished at sea. Within days, the story was written. Accidental fall. No foul play suspected. Case closed. But here the problem. Some cases aren't solved. They're simplified. The stepfather was interviewed. Once, his finances weren't deeply audited. His phone records weren't aggressively traced. And when he filed for divorce weeks later, no one revisited the file. Then he disappeared too. Years later, he's found. Alive. Traveling. Free. So here's the question no one asked loudly enough. If the case was closed so quickly, what exactly were they trying not to see? In the hours after a person disappears, something invisible begins to form. It isn't evidence. It isn't fact. It's a story. And once a story hardens, everything that follows is forced to fit inside it. When Eliza Carter vanished at sea, the story formed quickly, too quickly. A teenage girl. A cruise ship balcony. Open water in the dark. The conclusion almost wrote itself. Accident. Tragic. Unfortunate. Unavoidable. By sunrise, before the ship had even completed its emergency sweep, the language had already begun to settle into something firm. There is no indication of foul play. It was a sentence repeated in briefings. A sentence echoed in early reports. A sentence that carried a finality far heavier than anyone realized at the time. No indication. Not no evidence. Not no possibility. No indication. It sounded careful. It was. Because an indication requires someone to look for one. And the truth is, the search for anything beyond an accident never truly began. From the moment Eliza was reported missing, the timeline that investigators built revolved around one assumption: she went over the railing on her own. Whether she slipped, whether she leaned too far, whether she climbed, whether she jumped, the version didn't matter. What mattered was that she went over alone. That was the foundation. And once that foundation was poured, every piece of information afterward had to rest on top of it. The cruise line cooperated immediately. Security confirmed there had been no reported altercation in the hallway outside her cabin. No emergency calls placed from the room. No recorded disturbance. The absence of visible chaos was quietly interpreted as the absence of conflict. But ships are not silent places. They are floating cities. Doors close. Music hums. Footsteps blur together. The lack of a reported disturbance was not proof of peace. It was simply proof that no one had formally complained. Yet the difference between those two ideas was treated as irrelevant. The early internal report described the environment as calm, stable, routine. Eliza had been seen earlier that evening with her family. Nothing unusual noted. Nothing alarming recorded. And so the narrative leaned further toward accident. It was cleaner that way. Cruise ship disappearances are statistically rare. But when they do occur, accidental falls are the most publicly accepted explanation. People understand the ocean as dangerous. They understand railings as barriers that can fail. They understand gravity. What they struggle to understand is intent, conflict, human intervention. And so the explanation that required the least friction with public perception became the explanation that endured. Within 48 hours, the terminology shifted subtly. From missing to presumed lost at sea. From investigation ongoing to no foul play suspected. And once the phrase, "no foul play suspected," appears in official documentation, it does something powerful. It quiets urgency. It reduces the appetite for deeper questioning. It tells the public, and sometimes investigators themselves, that the hard part is over. But Naomi did not experience it that way. While officials moved toward closure, she moved toward confusion. Because the story being told outside did not match the night she remembered inside. Eliza had not seemed distressed. She had not seemed reckless. There had been no indication she would wander onto a balcony alone in the middle of the night. And yet the possibility that someone else was present, someone else who may have influenced, pressured, or even harmed her, was treated as theoretical, not probable. The early interviews reflected this tilt. Questions asked of family members focused on emotional state, on behavior, on whether Eliza had seemed troubled, whether she had been arguing with anyone, whether she had expressed fear or instability. The line of inquiry assumed internal cause, rarely external. Victor Hale was interviewed. He described the night calmly, recounted discovering Eliza missing, recounted notifying staff, recounted participating in the search. His demeanor was described as composed, cooperative, measured. These adjectives were entered into reports without scrutiny, as if calmness was confirmation, as if grief had a required performance. But composure is not proof of innocence. It is simply control. And control can mean many things. There were no immediate contradictions in Victor's account, no glaring inconsistencies that forced confrontation. And without those, the interview did not intensify. He was not pressed aggressively, not challenged beyond standard clarification, because the case was not yet viewed as adversarial. It was viewed as tragic. And tragedies do not demand interrogation. They demand sympathy. The ship's surveillance footage was reviewed internally. Cameras showed Eliza entering her cabin area earlier that night. They showed general hallway movement. They showed nothing dramatic. But what they did not show was treated as decisive. No footage captured her climbing. No footage captured her falling. No footage captured anyone pushing her. And so the absence of visual evidence was treated as quiet support for the accident theory. Yet cameras have blind spots, angles that miss crucial seconds, moments where reality occurs just outside the frame. The possibility that something happened in those gaps was acknowledged briefly and then dismissed, because acknowledging it fully would have required extending the investigation. Extending the investigation would have required resources. And resources are finite. International waters, complicated jurisdiction. Cruise ships operate under layered authority. Flag states, port states, corporate interests. Each entity has procedures. Each has thresholds for escalation. None benefit from prolonged ambiguity. And so the simplest classification prevailed. Accidental fall. No foul play suspected. Case pending recovery. When the ship docked, official responsibility shifted. Paperwork traveled. Reports were filed. But momentum had already slowed. Because urgency thrives on uncertainty. And uncertainty had been smoothed over by language. Naomi felt that smoothing immediately. Her questions were met with gentle explanations. The ocean is vast. Recovery is unlikely. These events, while rare, do occur. The implication was clear. This was a heartbreaking accident. Not a mystery. But Naomi could not reconcile the speed. The speed with which grief had been paired with finality. The speed with which investigation had shifted into administration. Within days, media coverage echoed official phrasing. Tragic accident. Family devastated. No evidence of foul play. The repetition cemented the idea in public consciousness. And once public consciousness aligns with official narrative, reopening becomes harder. Because reopening suggests error. It suggests oversight. It suggests something was missed. And institutions resist that suggestion instinctively. Inside the official file, the absence of physical evidence became central. No body recovered. No weapon found. No recorded altercation. But absence is neutral. It does not confirm one explanation over another. It simply indicates unknown. Yet in Eliza's case, unknown was gradually replaced with assumed. Assumed accident. Assumed fall. Assumed solitary moment. And Naomi watched this transformation with growing unease. She asked whether phone records would be analyzed deeply. She asked whether financial patterns would be examined. She asked whether the timeline would be reconstructed minute by minute. The answers were measured. We have no reason at this time. We see no indication of conflict. We are not treating this as suspicious. Every reassurance felt like a door closing softly. Not slammed, just eased shut. In the weeks that followed, the phrase "pending new evidence" appeared in correspondence. It sounded hopeful, but it functioned as containment. Because new evidence rarely appears without active pursuit. And active pursuit had already diminished. The case was not declared solved, but it was no longer driven. It drifted, and drifting cases become cold long before they are officially labeled as such. Years later, when Naomi would look back on those first days, she would recognize the precise moment the story hardened. It wasn't when the ship concluded its search. It wasn't when media coverage faded. It was when the early assumption was never challenged. When accident stopped being one possibility among many and became the lens through which all information was filtered. If Victor seemed calm, it supported accident. If there was no recorded fight, it supported accident. If no one heard a scream, it supported accident. Every detail was interpreted through that single frame. And once a frame is chosen, everything fits. Even if it shouldn't. The tragedy of early narrative closure is not that it lies. It's that it simplifies. It reduces complexity to comfort. It reduces possibility to probability. And in doing so, it may discard the very threads that could unravel something darker. Eliza Carter vanished in the night. But the investigation did not vanish. It narrowed. And in narrowing too quickly, it may have abandoned the one thing investigations are meant to protect. Doubt. Because doubt keeps cases alive. Doubt forces deeper questions. Doubt resists neat endings. And in this case, doubt was quietly set aside, replaced with a sentence that would echo for years. No foul play suspected. It sounded responsible. It sounded official. It sounded final. And for nearly a decade, it stood unchallenged. Until the day someone realized that what had been called unsolved had never truly been explored. Investigations are defined as much by what they pursue as by what they ignore. In the aftermath of Eliza Carter's disappearance, there was activity. Reports were filed, statements were taken, procedures were followed. But procedure is not the same as depth. And depth is where truth usually hides. When a person vanishes under suspicious or unclear circumstances, there are standard layers of inquiry designed to eliminate doubt: scene reconstruction, digital forensics, financial review, behavioral analysis, cross-reference timelines. Each layer exists for a reason. In Eliza's case, many of those layers were touched. Few were peeled back. The cabin was inspected. That much was documented. Photographs were taken, personal belongings catalogued, no obvious signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, no broken fixtures. But cruise ship cabins are confined spaces. They hold thousands of invisible details: fibers, prints, smudges, pressure marks, displaced items too subtle for casual observation. A deep forensic sweep requires time. It requires a presumption that something may have occurred inside that space. The cabin inspection, in this case, operated under a different presumption: that nothing had. The balcony railing was measured, its height noted, its structure confirmed compliant with safety standards. There was no sign of structural failure, which meant in official reasoning that if Eliza went over, she did so by choice or misstep. But compliance with regulation does not prevent human interaction from altering circumstance. No extensive luminol testing was reported. No reconstruction of body positioning. No independent forensic team brought in to examine the scene outside the cruise line's internal review. Because once accident was presumed, the cabin was no longer a potential crime scene. It was simply the last known location of a tragic event. Then there was digital evidence. In the modern world, absence rarely occurs without a digital echo. Phones record movement, messages capture tone, searches reveal state of mind. Eliza's phone was reviewed for surface-level content: text messages, social media posts, recent calls. Nothing overtly alarming surfaced. No farewell message, no explicit distress. And so the lack of visible red flags was interpreted as confirmation that nothing external had precipitated her disappearance. But deep digital forensics is not limited to reading recent texts. It involves metadata, deleted content recovery, time-stamped location data, connection logs. It involves mapping who contacted whom and when. It involves examining not just what was said, but what was erased. There is no public record that such an exhaustive analysis occurred. Victor's phone was not immediately seized for independent forensic imaging. His call logs were not aggressively subpoenaed in the earliest hours. His device was treated as a cooperative accessory, not a potential repository of contradiction. Phone records can reveal patterns invisible in conversation. Repeated calls to unfamiliar numbers. Late-night activity. Gaps in signal. Changes in usage. But without immediate preservation, those patterns can fade. Data retention policies vary. Delays matter. And in this case, delay was built into the assumption of accident. Financial records tell their own stories. Money moves in anticipation. It shifts when people plan change, when they prepare departure, when they restructure life. In the weeks surrounding Eliza's disappearance, financial transactions occurred that Naomi would later describe as unusual. Transfers not aligned with routine spending. Withdrawals that did not correspond to travel expenses. But these anomalies were not subjected to early forensic accounting, because financial motive was never formally considered. Motive implies possibility of intent. Intent implies potential crime. And potential crime was never the investigative posture. The cruise ship's internal security footage was reviewed. That much is certain. But internal review differs from independent audit. Cruise ships operate thousands of cameras. Hallways, stairwells, public decks, entry points. But cameras have blind spots. Angles where footage does not overlap. Moments where bodies move just outside the frame. A rigorous reconstruction would involve mapping every camera angle along Eliza's last known path. Calculating time gaps. Identifying who entered and exited adjacent spaces. Cross-referencing those movements with guest key card logs. There is no indication that such a granular reconstruction was completed. Because the narrative did not demand it. Witness canvassing was limited to immediate proximity. Passengers in adjacent cabins were asked if they heard disturbance. Most reported nothing unusual. But ships are loud. Engines hum. Doors slam. Music carries. Silence in one cabin does not equal absence of sound in another. Yet the absence of reported disturbance became supportive evidence for accident. The ocean itself was treated as the final variable. Search and rescue protocols were initiated. Coordinates calculated. Currents analyzed. But recovery at sea is notoriously difficult. Once the search window passed, probability declined sharply. And with declining probability of recovery came declining investigative energy. Without a body, certain forensic paths close. But others remain. The lack of remains does not eliminate the need to examine human behavior preceding disappearance. It amplifies it. Yet behavior was assessed at surface level. Eliza's emotional state was described as stable. Her interactions earlier in the evening were not confrontational. She had made plans for the next day. These details argued against suicide. They also complicated pure accident. But rather than deepen suspicion, they were absorbed into ambiguity. Teenagers can be unpredictable. Moments can be impulsive. The language of unpredictability replaced the language of scrutiny. One of the most telling omissions was timeline compression. On a cruise ship, keycards log entry into cabins. Elevators track usage. Purchases are digitally recorded. Reconstructing the final hour of a missing person's life requires minute-by-minute mapping. Who was awake? Who moved? Who accessed which spaces? The publicly available documentation does not reflect a comprehensive reconstruction at that level. Victor's movements that night were accepted based on his statement. Corroborated generally. Not stress-tested rigorously. Stress testing means asking the same question multiple ways. Separating timelines. Looking for micro-inconsistencies. Revisiting answers days later to detect variation. Such techniques are standard when suspicion is present. Suspicion was not present here. Therefore, neither was the pressure. Jurisdiction complicated matters further. The ship sailed under one flag, docked in another nation. Passengers held multiple citizenships. Each layer added administrative friction, and friction discourages expansion. When a case appears straightforward, institutions resist adding complexity. Because complexity multiplies paperwork, and paperwork demands justification. The absence of early aggressive action created a paradox. As time passed, the lack of collected evidence became justification for not revisiting the case. There is no new evidence. But new evidence rarely surfaces spontaneously. It must be extracted. And extraction requires suspicion, which never fully materialized. Naomi sensed this drift. She felt the narrowing. She asked about forensic re-examination, asked whether independent investigators could review footage, asked whether financial experts could analyze anomalies. The responses were procedural. The case is not classified as criminal. Resources are prioritized accordingly. Without classification, there is no allocation. Without allocation, there is no depth. And so the file thickened with administrative closure while remaining thin in forensic detail. The tragedy of evidence not collected is that its absence becomes invisible. No one can examine a test that was never run. No one can review footage that was never preserved. No one can question a timeline that was never reconstructed. What remains is silence disguised as resolution. Years later, when Victor Hale was sighted alive and living under quiet obscurity, the question resurfaced with sharper edges. Had his devices ever been imaged fully? Had his financial movements been traced comprehensively? Had the cabin been treated as potential crime scene rather than accident site? Each unanswered procedural question formed its own indictment. Not of malice, but of momentum. Because investigations are propelled by urgency, and urgency had been dampened within days. The official stance had shaped the scope, and the scope had defined the depth. The evidence that wasn't collected could not be revisited retroactively with the same clarity. Data degrades. Memories fade. Systems overwrite. The early hours after disappearance are irreplaceable. They are the window when doubt is strongest and evidence freshest. In Eliza's case, that window narrowed quickly. Not because someone declared certainty loudly, but because certainty seeped in quietly. Through language, through tone, through the reassuring cadence of no foul play suspected. And once that phrase anchored the file, everything else floated away. What remains now is not simply a question of what happened that night. It is a question of what might have been discovered had the investigation resisted comfort. Had it treated uncertainty as threat rather than inconvenience? Had it assumed nothing? Because sometimes the difference between an unsolved case and an abandoned one is not evidence. It is appetite. And in this case, the appetite for deeper scrutiny may have disappeared long before the truth did. In nearly every disappearance, there is a circle, an invisible perimeter drawn around the missing person. Inside that circle are the people closest to them. Family, partners, friends. Statistically, proximity matters. Emotion matters. Access matters. Investigators know this. It is not accusation, it is probability. And probability demands uncomfortable questions. In the early hours after Eliza Carter vanished, Victor Hale stood squarely inside that circle. He was not a distant acquaintance. He was not a stranger glimpsed on security footage. He was the last adult known to share a cabin with her. He was the man who reported her missing. He was the one who helped shape the first narrative of that night. And yet, almost immediately, the circle widened around him instead of tightening. He was interviewed. That is documented. He answered questions calmly. He described the timeline as he remembered it. He explained when he last saw Eliza. Explained discovering her absence. Explained alerting ship staff. His account did not contain glaring contradictions. And in the absence of contradiction, pressure eased. But contradictions are not the only indicator of deception. Sometimes what matters is not inconsistency. It is incompleteness. The first interviews focused heavily on Eliza's state of mind. Had she been upset? Had there been tension between them? Had she seemed withdrawn? Victor's responses were measured. She seemed fine. Nothing unusual. We were enjoying the trip. These answers were taken at face value, because there was no established reason to doubt him. And once accident became the working theory, his proximity became less threatening. If she slipped, his presence was irrelevant. If she leaned too far, his timeline held. If she went over alone, then he was simply a witness to tragedy. The subtle shift happened here. Victor transitioned from potential variable to grieving family member. Language around him softened. He was described as cooperative, devastated, supportive of the search. These descriptors carried weight, because grief, when performed within expected parameters, shields. He did not raise his voice, did not display visible hostility, did not refuse questions. He remained present during the ship's immediate response. These behaviors were interpreted as transparency. But transparency requires more than availability. It requires scrutiny. There were elements of his timeline that could have been stress-tested more rigorously. The exact sequence of events in the cabin. The last verbal exchange between him and Eliza. The precise moment he noticed she was missing. Time compresses in crisis. Memories blur. But that is precisely why interviews are revisited. Why timelines are reconstructed again and again until cracks appear. There is no public record indicating that Victor underwent multiple rounds of detailed re-interviewing. No indication of forensic interview techniques designed to detect microshifts in narrative. His initial account became the anchor. Anchors are useful, but they can also prevent drift into uncomfortable territory. When Naomi later raised concerns about his rapid emotional detachment, about the divorce filed weeks later, about the financial anomalies she discovered, those developments were not retroactively folded into the disappearance investigation with urgency. They were categorized as separate issues. Marital breakdown, grief response, personal choice. The stepfather question did not intensify. It faded. One of the most telling decisions was semantic. Victor was never formally designated as a suspect. Not publicly, not internally, according to available records. He was classified as a witness, a family member, a cooperating party. That classification matters, because once someone is not a suspect, investigative thresholds shift. Search warrants become harder to justify. Device seizures require stronger cause. Financial subpoenas demand clearer motive. And motive was never officially established. Without motive, there is no escalation. Without escalation, there is no depth. There were subtle inconsistencies in timing that, in a more adversarial posture, might have triggered additional review. The exact window between when Eliza was last seen and when she was reported missing. The delay, if any, between awareness and notification. The sequence of cabin movements. But in a framework of accident, these questions seemed procedural rather than critical. He was not placed under sustained observation during the immediate aftermath. Not monitored for behavioral anomalies beyond general grief assessment. Not subjected to polygraph examination, even if only to measure reaction. Because again, suspicion had not crystallized. The system does not escalate without formal suspicion. And formal suspicion requires someone to articulate doubt clearly and loudly. Naomi articulated doubt. But doubt from a grieving spouse can be reframed as emotional displacement. Trauma seeks explanation. Trauma seeks blame. That is the quiet subtext often applied. And so her concerns about Victor's detachment, about his refusal to revisit details, about his rapid shift toward divorce, were filtered through the lens of grief psychology rather than investigative redirection. The divorce itself was startling in its speed. Weeks after a child's disappearance, the marriage dissolved. For some investigators, such timing might provoke reconsideration. But in this case, it was categorized as secondary fallout. Tragedy strains relationships. People cope differently. End of analysis. Victor's eventual disappearance from Naomi's life, closing accounts, disconnecting numbers, relocating without clear forwarding address, occurred after the case had already cooled. And because the case had cooled, his disappearance did not reignite it. Instead, it reinforced the narrative of a man unable to cope. He wanted distance. He needed a fresh start. These are phrases that humanize. They soften. They neutralize suspicion. Yet distance can serve more than emotional relief. It can serve insulation. It can reduce the likelihood of future questioning. It can prevent proximity to those who might one day revisit inconsistencies. But the stepfather question had already lost momentum. Once a person is not formally flagged early, revisiting that decision requires institutional humility. It requires acknowledging that the initial framing may have been incomplete. And institutions are not designed for reflexive doubt. They are designed for procedural confidence. Years later, when Victor Hale resurfaced in a different country, living quietly, his continued existence exposed a structural vulnerability. Because if the man closest to the disappearance could dismantle his life so thoroughly without triggering renewed investigative scrutiny, then perhaps he had never been examined with sufficient intensity in the first place. Proximity does not prove guilt, but proximity demands endurance. The kind of endurance that revisits interviews, that reanalyzes timelines, that reassesses behavior in light of subsequent developments. In Eliza's case, proximity was acknowledged. It was not pursued. The stepfather question did not explode. It evaporated. And evaporation leaves no visible trace. No dramatic turning point. Just gradual thinning. Until the idea that he might require deeper examination felt outdated. Unnecessary. The narrative had stabilized. Accident at sea. No foul play suspected. Grieving family. Case pending new evidence. Victor Hale fit comfortably within that structure. And once someone fits, it becomes harder to dislodge them. Because dislodging requires disruption. And disruption invites scrutiny not only of the subject, but of the system that cleared him. So the circle that should have tightened expanded instead. And the man at its center walked forward unencumbered. Not proven innocent. Not proven guilty. Simply untested beyond the surface. The stepfather question did not disappear because it was answered. It disappeared because it was never fully asked. And questions unasked have a way of waiting. Waiting for time to pass. Waiting for assumptions to settle. Waiting for a single moment that forces them back into the light. That moment was coming. But for years, the silence held. And inside that silence, the most obvious variable in the room remained untouched. Cases rarely end with a dramatic declaration. They do not always close with a slammed folder or a public announcement of finality. More often, they fade. They move from urgency to maintenance, From maintenance to dormancy, from dormancy to archive. And once a case enters the archive, reopening it requires more than curiosity. It requires justification. In the months following Eliza Carter's disappearance, the investigation did not officially close. It transitioned. The language shifted subtly. Active investigation became ongoing review. Ongoing review became pending new evidence. The phrasing sounded procedural, measured, responsible, but each transition marked a reduction in momentum. Resources were reallocated, personnel reassigned. New cases emerged that demanded immediate attention, cases with visible crime scenes, identifiable suspects, tangible violence. Compared to those, a presumed accidental fall at sea did not command urgency. The ocean had claimed her. That was the working premise. And oceans are difficult to prosecute. Jurisdiction complicated everything. The ship sailed under one nation's flag. The disappearance occurred in international waters. Passengers and crew represented multiple countries. Responsibility fractured across borders. When responsibility fractures, accountability diffuses. Each agency handles its portion. No single entity feels full ownership. And without ownership, there is no champion. No one pushing relentlessly for deeper inquiry. Paperwork accumulated. Reports summarized prior findings. Each summary referenced the same early conclusion: no foul play suspected. Once that phrase appears in official documentation, it echoes through every subsequent review. Supervisors read it. Administrators cite it. Budget decisions consider it. Why allocate extended resources to a case already leaning toward accident? The file thickened with procedural updates. Search efforts concluded. Insurance forms processed. Internal communications archived. But thickness does not equal depth. Volume does not equal intensity. The administrative weight of a case can increase even as investigative vigor declines. Naomi began to notice this shift not through a dramatic notification, but through tone. Calls were returned less frequently. Updates grew shorter. The language became formal. Detached. She requested meetings to discuss new concerns: Victor's financial anomalies, his abrupt divorce, his disappearance. Each time she was reminded gently that those developments, while unfortunate, did not alter the original classification. The case, she was told, remained open pending new evidence. Open, but not active. There is a difference. Active cases generate leads. Open cases wait for them. Waiting is passive. It places the burden on time, on coincidence, on outsiders to stumble upon something actionable. Waiting shifts responsibility away from investigators and toward fate. The concept of pending new evidence sounds hopeful, but it can function as containment. Because what qualifies as new? A confession, a body, a direct eyewitness. Incremental suspicion rarely meets that threshold. Without a triggering event dramatic enough to justify reopening, files remain undisturbed. Internal performance metrics also shape momentum. Agencies track clearance rates, case backlogs, resource allocation efficiency. An unsolved homicide carries different statistical weight than a presumed accidental death. Reclassifying a case from accident to potential criminal investigation alters those metrics. It introduces complexity. It demands explanation. Bureaucracies favor stability. Stability resists reclassification. Reclassification suggests prior assessment may have been incomplete, and incomplete assessments reflect on process. No one intentionally suppresses truth, but systems are designed to preserve confidence. Confidence in initial evaluation. Confidence in procedural adequacy. Confidence in institutional competence. To revisit Eliza's case aggressively years later would require acknowledging that the early narrative may have narrowed too quickly, that certain avenues were not explored fully, that doubt was perhaps minimized prematurely. Such acknowledgments are rare without external pressure. Naomi attempted to apply pressure. She compiled timelines, collected financial statements, documented Victor's disappearance. She wrote letters, requested formal reconsideration. The responses remained measured. Your concerns are noted. At this time, there is insufficient evidence to alter the case classification. Insufficient evidence. The phrase loops back to the earlier problem. Evidence must be gathered to exist. If it is not gathered, it cannot be evaluated. And if it cannot be evaluated, it cannot be deemed sufficient. Thus, the absence of collected evidence becomes the justification for inaction. A closed circuit. As years passed, personnel changed. Detectives transferred. Supervisors retired. Institutional memory faded. New administrators reviewed summaries rather than raw files. They inherited conclusions rather than questions. When Naomi contacted the department years later, she often spoke to someone unfamiliar with the emotional weight of the case. They saw dates, file numbers, a classification. They did not see the night. They did not hear the ocean. They did not feel the urgency that once existed. And without lived urgency, the file remained administrative. There were also external considerations: cruise industry relationships, international diplomatic sensitivities, public perception. Labeling a disappearance at sea as criminal carries ripple effects. It invites scrutiny of safety protocols, of surveillance practices, of corporate liability. While there is no evidence that such concerns drove decisions directly, institutional environments are rarely isolated from broader context. Complexity discourages escalation. Escalation invites friction. Friction consumes resources. And so stability prevailed. The case did not explode into controversy. It settled into quiet dormancy. For Naomi, dormancy felt like erasure. Each year that passed without renewed inquiry deepened the sense that the system had made peace with uncertainty. But she had not. She lived in the gap between what was declared and what was felt, between official language and instinct. She understood that proving wrongdoing required evidence, but she also understood that discovering evidence required will. And will had diminished. The turning point came not from within the system, but from outside it. When Victor Hale was sighted alive in 2023, living quietly, traveling, existing without apparent concern, the dormancy cracked. Because his disappearance, once framed as grief-driven withdrawal, now appeared strategic. His continued absence from scrutiny revealed a tension between assumption and reality. Naomi submitted the new information: photographs, dates, locations, proof that the man closest to her daughter's disappearance had not simply dissolved into anonymity. He had relocated, rebuilt, re-emerged. The response was cautious, professional, measured. Thank you for providing this information. We will review and determine whether further inquiry is warranted. Warranted. The word carried weight. It implied that reopening required justification, that new evidence must reach a threshold. But what threshold? The man at the center of the circle had been located after years of silence. If that did not warrant reconsideration, what would? Bureaucracy does not resist truth intentionally. It resists disruption. Disruption requires energy. Energy requires resources. Resources require prioritization. And prioritization often follows visibility. Public pressure, media attention, political consequence. Absent those forces, files remain stable. But stability is not the same as accuracy. And when stability masks uncertainty, truth becomes secondary to procedure. Eliza's case was not declared solved. It was not formally closed with fanfare. It was simply allowed to rest. Rest in a category that required nothing further unless something undeniable emerged. But undeniable evidence rarely appears without someone willing to disturb the file, to question language, to challenge assumptions, to reopen what was deemed sufficiently explained. The case was not unsolved in the traditional sense. It was contained within administrative boundaries, contained within early narrative framing, contained within resource limitations and jurisdictional complexity, contained long enough for time to soften urgency, until the sighting of Victor Hale introduced friction once more. Friction disrupts stability. It forces re-evaluation. It demands articulation of why prior conclusions were sufficient. And in that articulation, weaknesses surface. The system now faced a question it had avoided for years. If the case was handled thoroughly, why did the man closest to the disappearance vanish without triggering renewed scrutiny? And if renewed scrutiny is warranted now, what does that imply about then? Bureaucracy thrives on continuity. Truth sometimes requires rupture. The rupture was coming. But first, the file would have to be opened again. Not as archive, not as summary, but as possibility. And possibility is the one thing bureaucracy struggles to contain. For nearly a decade, the case rested in a quiet category. Not solved, not active, filed under tragedy, referenced rarely, disturbed only by Naomi's persistence. And then, with one email attachment, the stillness fractured. The photograph Rachel sent was clear. Not grainy, not distant. Victor Hale stood outside a coastal hotel, sunlight cutting across his face. Older, leaner, grayish, but undeniably him. The man who had stood beside Naomi at the funeral. The man who had filed for divorce weeks later. The man who had erased himself. Alive, present, ordinary. The image did something the original Disappearance never had. It introduced immediacy. Because now the past was not abstract. It had coordinates. Naomi forwarded the photograph to authorities within hours. Included the metadata, the hotel name, the date stamp. Her message was brief. He's been found. This time the response was different. Not warmer, not apologetic, but alert. Confirmation requests were sent. Identity verification initiated. Travel logs examined. For the first time in years, Victor Hale's name re-entered an active system. His passport activity surfaced. Recent entries. Recent exits. He had not vanished into obscurity. He had traveled freely, confidently. The man once connected to a high-profile disappearance had crossed borders without restriction. No flags, no alerts, because officially he had done nothing wrong. That was the foundation, and foundations are difficult to disturb. But the photograph created a tension the file could no longer absorb quietly. Internal discussions began. Not public, not yet. Supervisors reviewed the original classification, re-examined the phrase that had shaped everything. No foul play suspected. They asked whether that phrasing had been premature, whether investigative thresholds had been applied too narrowly, whether the proximity of Victor to the event had warranted deeper scrutiny at the time. Some defended the initial assessment. Evidence had been limited. Behavior had not indicated violence. The absence of a body complicated forensic direction. Others questioned whether limited evidence had resulted from limited pursuit. It was the first crack. Not an admission, but a reconsideration. Naomi was asked to attend a meeting. In person, not over the phone. The difference mattered. She walked into the building she had entered years earlier, but the atmosphere felt altered. Less certain, more cautious. Across the table, officials reviewed the photograph again. They acknowledged that Victor's disappearance from her life had never been fully integrated into the original investigative framework. They admitted that financial anomalies had not been examined exhaustively. They conceded that the classification of accident had influenced scope. The word conceded was not spoken aloud, but it hovered. Naomi asked a question that had waited nearly a decade. If this had happened differently, if the assumption hadn't been accident, would you have looked harder? Silence followed. Measured. Institutional. And then one of them answered carefully. We may have approached certain elements differently. It was not an apology, but it was an opening. The file was officially reactivated. Not reclassified. Reactivated. A subtle but significant shift. Reactivation allows inquiry without admitting error. It preserves structure while permitting expansion. Victor Hale was now located. His residence identified. His recent movements mapped. Investigators began reconstructing not just the night of Eliza's disappearance, but the years that followed. Why had he severed contact so completely? Why had he relocated without trace? Why had financial transfers preceded his withdrawal? Why had international calls clustered around the period of crisis? Each question, once peripheral, now moved toward center. But reopening a file years later introduces complications. Data degraded. Witness memories softened. Physical evidence long inaccessible. Whatever had been missed in the early days could not be recreated perfectly. Time had intervened. And time protects secrets. Victor was contacted. Not confronted. Contacted. The conversation was brief. He confirmed his identity. Confirmed his location. Expressed surprise that the matter had resurfaced. He maintained his original account. Consistent. Calm. He stated that he had left Naomi because the grief was unbearable. That he had rebuilt quietly. That he wished no further involvement. He did not sound panicked. He did not sound defensive. He sounded prepared, which unsettled Naomi more than denial ever could. Prepared people anticipate questions, and anticipation implies awareness. Investigators requested voluntary cooperation for further review. He agreed, without hesitation. That too was noted, because innocence often welcomes transparency, but so does confidence. As the renewed inquiry unfolded, analysts began re-examining archived materials, digital backups, old interview transcripts, financial summaries. They noticed small gaps, minutes unaccounted for, data not preserved, requests not escalated. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just absences, the kind that only appear significant in hindsight. One analyst, reviewing key card logs from the night of the disappearance, identified a discrepancy in timestamp sequencing, a minor inconsistency between door access and reported movement. It had been overlooked initially, perhaps dismissed as system lag, perhaps deemed irrelevant under the accident assumption. Now it glowed differently. Another review of phone metadata revealed a call placed from Victor's device to an international number shortly after the ship's emergency alert. The number had never been fully traced, because at the time there had been no predicate for doing so. Now there was. The call duration was short, but its timing was precise. Moments matter, especially moments after crisis. The more they looked, the more the early narrative felt less like conclusion and more like container. A structure built to house ambiguity comfortably. But ambiguity, once disturbed, resists containment. Media caught wind of the reactivation. Quietly at first. A brief mention. Authorities reviewing crew's disappearance after new information emerges. Public curiosity reignited. Old footage resurfaced. The funeral. Victor standing still. The phrase "no foul play suspected" replayed in segments. Questions multiplied online. Why now? What changed? Had something been missed? The department issued a statement. We are conducting a thorough review in light of newly received information. Thorough. The word carried weight, because thorough had not been the perception years earlier. Behind closed doors, tension escalated. Reopening a case challenges institutional memory. It forces reflection on past decisions. It invites external scrutiny. But it also creates possibility. And possibility is unpredictable. Naomi felt both fear and hope rising together. Fear that renewed inquiry might confirm the worst. Hope that uncertainty would finally be replaced with clarity. But clarity is not guaranteed by reactivation. It is earned through persistence. And persistence collides with resistance. Late one evening, investigators received preliminary results from the renewed financial analysis. Transfers that once seemed isolated began to form pattern when examined across a broader time frame. Small movements aligning with geographic shifts. Expenses corresponding to pre-planned relocation rather than impulsive escape. The implication was subtle but profound. Planning had occurred. Before, not after. The timing overlapped with the cruise. Overlapped with the disappearance. Overlapped with the divorce. Planning suggests foresight. Foresight suggests intention. But intention requires proof. And proof remains elusive without direct linkage. Then came the message that shifted everything. A forensic review of archived cruise surveillance, backed up longer than initially believed, revealed an angle not previously analyzed in depth. A camera positioned at the far end of the deck, not focused on Eliza's balcony, but capturing peripheral movement. The footage was grainy, low light, partial obstruction, but within it, a silhouette appeared at a time that did not align cleanly with Victor's original account. The timestamp required verification. The figure required enhancement. But the presence was undeniable. Someone had been on that deck within minutes of the reported timeline. The silhouette paused, moved, disappeared from frame. Investigators froze the image, zoomed, adjusted contrast. The shape was indistinct, but its existence disrupted the simplicity of accident. Naomi was not shown the footage immediately, not until verification progressed, but she was informed that new material was under review. New material. The phrase echoed differently this time, because this was not passive waiting. This was excavation. Victor was contacted again, told that additional review was underway, told that certain elements required clarification. He remained composed. He agreed to speak further. But this time, there was a pause before his agreement. A fraction of hesitation. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but noted. Investigators scheduled a formal interview. In person, not by phone. Victor confirmed his availability. The date was set. The location secured. For the first time since the night at sea, the circle began tightening. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. As the interview approached, analysts continued enhancing the surveillance still. Frame by frame, light adjustment, pattern comparison. They compared the silhouette's height, build, posture against known images. The match was not conclusive, but it was not dismissible either. The key card discrepancy, the phone call timing, the financial pattern, the silhouette. Individually, none proved anything. Together, they suggested something the early narrative had not allowed space for. Possibility. The night before Victor's scheduled interview, Naomi received a call. Not from media, not from a friend, from the department. The tone was different, urgent, measured but tight. They informed her that during extended forensic review of archived data, an additional digital artifact had surfaced. A partial audio capture from a deck microphone system rarely accessed in prior analysis. The audio was incomplete. Wind distortion, mechanical hum, but within it there was a fragment. A voice, male, raised, not shouting, but strained, followed by a sound that did not resemble a slip, nor a fall. The recording was seconds long, barely audible, but real. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. For years, she had lived inside assumption. Now assumption was cracking audibly. The department would not confirm content definitively until enhanced analysis concluded. They cautioned restraint. They emphasized that interpretation remained preliminary. But the existence of the fragment altered everything. Because accident rarely produces argument. An argument introduces conflict. Conflict redefines narrative. Victor's interview was rescheduled sooner. Moved up. Quietly. Discreetly. The circle tightened further. Naomi did not sleep that night. For nearly a decade, she had carried doubt alone. Now doubt had structure. Data. Sound. Silhouette. Pattern. But structure can collapse under pressure. The truth, if emerging, would not surface gently. It would rupture. And ruptures expose not only individuals, but systems. As dawn approached, investigators finalized preparation for the interview. They organized the footage, the financial charts, the call logs, the timestamp discrepancies, the audio fragment. They rehearsed sequencing. Which question first? Which evidence last? How to confront without accusation. How to observe reaction. Because sometimes reaction reveals what words conceal. Victor arrived on time. Calm, well-dressed, composed. He shook hands, made eye contact, sat down. The recorder clicked on. And as the first question began, about the night at sea, about timeline, about movement on deck, Victor leaned back slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to create space between himself and the table. A subtle shift, the kind that means nothing, or everything. The door closed behind him. The interview began. And for the first time since Eliza Carter vanished into the dark ocean, the narrative was no longer fixed. It was fragile, balanced on seconds of grainy footage, on a sliver of distorted audio, on patterns once dismissed. If the early assumption had been wrong, if the case had not been accident but confrontation, then every decision made in those first days would stand exposed. And as Victor inhaled to answer the first renewed question about that night, the investigators pressed play.